Welcome to the Business Talk, a global podcast series that highlights distinguished faculty members and their impactful scholarly contributions. I am Deepak, your host from India. We are delighted to welcome Dr. Aparna Joshi, Professor of Management and Organizations at the Stephen M. Ross School of Business, University of Michigan, to Business Talk today. Before we get started, I'd like to introduce the guest for today's episode. Professor Aparna is a globally recognized organizational scholar whose work explores how individuals perceive, navigate, and collaborate across differences in modern workplaces. Her research centers on understanding how social distinctions, particularly gender, shape inequality across professional settings, including science, law, engineering, and executive leadership. Over more than 2 decades, she has developed influential evidence-based frameworks that help organizations translate theory into practice, enabling leaders to foster inclusion and drive meaningful systemic change. Dr. Aparna Joshi has previously held faculty positions at Pennsylvania State University's Smith College of Business and the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. Her research has been published in the field's most prestigious journals, including Administrative Science Quarterly, Academy of Management Journal, and Organization Science, and has been supported by the National Science Foundation. Her contributions have earned widespread recognition, including the 2025 Academy of Management Journal Impact Award for research that has shaped both scholarship and practice over 2 decades. She is also a recipient of the Cummings Award for Early to Mid-Career Scholarly Achievement and was named a Fellow of the Academy of Management. Featured among Stanford's top 2% of scientists globally, Professor Aparna's work continues to influence how organizations think about leadership, equity, and inclusion. Beyond her research, she has played a significant role in advancing the academic community, serving on editorial boards of leading journals, acting as associate editor for top publications, and mentoring doctoral scholars who now hold faculty positions at premier institutions worldwide. In today's episode, Professor Aparna Joshi joins us to unpack her groundbreaking research and integrative conceptual review of gender bias in leader evaluations, an observer-focused motive-driven process model. For decades, the conversation around gender bias in leadership has focused on what women should do differently. Professor Joshi's research flipped that question entirely, shifting the lens from the leader being evaluated to the motivation of the people doing the evaluating. This is a conversation that will fundamentally change how we think about fairness in the workplace. Let's not keep you waiting. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Aparna Joshi to the conversation. Professor Aparna, it's a distinct privilege to welcome you on Business Talk. We are grateful to you for accepting our invitation.
Hi, Deepak. Thank you so much for having me. It's really a pleasure to be here, and thank you for shedding the spotlight on our research. I do think it is a substantive departure from the kind of ways in which we have been thinking about gender bias in leadership. So I really do appreciate this opportunity to talk with you.
Thank you, Professor. Professor, your paper argues that observers are not passive conduits of stereotypes, but active evaluators whose motives shape how they appraise women leaders. Could you start by unpacking this shift from fixing women leaders to focusing on observer motives?
Yeah, sure. So for decades in our research, and this is implicit and sometimes explicit, but mostly implicit, is that the idea is that social bias or stereotypes, as we like to call them, are everywhere. And we as human beings automatically use those bias lenses when we evaluate leaders of who are underrepresented, such as women leaders in most upper echelons in most organizations. So here the key idea, and based on that notion, the interventions that we focused on have also focused on awareness training, so awareness of stereotypes or unconscious bias training that your listeners might have also heard of. Or they're then targeted towards specific career development for women, such as, find allies, build networks, some leadership development type training for women as well. I don't know if you remember this, but some years ago, the Lean In movement was very popular, remember? And I think, again, very well intentioned, but the focus was on, how can women navigate that delicate balance between being too aggressive versus not being aggressive enough or being too soft and so on. And it had to be just right. And the research, as I said, is very well intentioned, and it may actually, the academic research, I don't, as I'm not going to say was aimed at fixing the women kind of notion by any means, but the way it's been translated and then disseminated somehow has left people with that impression, right? Or so, and in fact, whenever I give talks to women executives, women academics as well, inevitably someone stays back after the talk and they'll say, thank you for telling us all about the barriers that women face to get to the higher levels. What can I do about it? How can I navigate that barrier? And so when these young people, young women mostly, would stop and ask me these questions, I certainly, we have answers to those questions based on our research, but I also felt that something was missing from that. We were leaving something on the table. So that's actually what motivated this research. And as you noted, the idea is to flip the narrative in the most academically informed way, not just flip the narrative, but in an academically informed way, to take the focus on observers. So this very same behavior, even when women are doing it right, might get penalized by one observer, but then might be appreciated by another observer, right? So the question we are asking is not what the leader can do differently, but how can we better understand those goals and motives that shape these very different evaluations of the same leader?
Professor, you identify three core observer motives: identity protection, value alignment, and resource dependence. Can you walk us through these motives with a concrete example of how each might change the way the same women leader is evaluated?
Yeah, great question, because it's sort of the crux, the meat and potatoes, if you will, of our paper. So I think it's helpful to think about how we can, what this might look like, right? It's a good question. Yes, those three motives, by the way, are based on how, over the many decades, we did a deep dive into the research. And so, over the many decades, how these mechanisms have been studied in the past. But yeah, there were three motives we talked about: an identity motive, a value based motive, and a resource dependence motive. Let's use one scenario, all right? Let's say a woman leader has to make a tough call, which can happen to any leader, but let's say in this case it's a woman leader, to cut costs by 25% in a struggling division. Now let's take three observers who kind of are prototypes of our three mechanisms, right? Uh, a male executive who is at her level, maybe on the board of directors, or even in the top, in the C-suite, and has been felt threatened by this leader's rise. Because remember, these folks at the top, they're competing for the same position. So imagine this woman leader has that position and he doesn't. So there is obviously a competitive threat issue, or what we call an identity protection motive going on. And so for this particular executive, this may be seen as too assertive, too bold. Does she really know what she's doing? Kind of reaction from this particular executive, because the conclusion he wants to reach is that the female leader doesn't belong there, right? So that's the conclusion he wants to reach. Now let's take another very different observer. This observer is the one who's the outgoing CEO, has mentored and sponsored the leader's rise to this current position, clearly has a lot of faith in her abilities. They might see the same move and actually praise it for its decisiveness, because he appreciates how tough it must be to take this challenging move for an incoming leader, right? So that's a very different. So she's taking something that, in a stereotype sense, can be seen as counter stereotypical for women. Being assertive and bold is considered counter stereotypical, but might see that as, yes, this is what we need, right? We need this bold move. Now let's take a third person who's a line manager in that struggling division. This line manager depends on the leader's effectiveness for his own future, right, in their organization. So that's the resource dependence motive. And this line manager might say, okay, this looks bold. Let me get more information. I want to understand this better, because literally my career depends on the success of this move. So he is motivated to learn more, understand more, of why this may be needed, because they want to make sure that their own jobs are secure, the company's future is secure, right? So they have that they are dependent on this leader for the success of their company, the success of their own careers in that company. So is their job secure? So again, same behavior, three very different verdicts from three different observers who are filtering it through their own lens, through their own motives.
Professor, a big contribution of your model is explaining why the research shows both penalties and occasional advantages for women leaders in similar contexts. How does a motive-driven lens help us make sense of these seemingly contradictory findings?
Yeah, so that has been another, over the many decades, the research on gender in leadership has grown exponentially. And we track that as well. And but there's a tension in the field. Our so and as you can probably tell from this previous scenario that I just provided, if we today randomly picked five papers for this podcast and just clicked on each of them, you're going to find something like, in paper A, the women in that paper actually are penalized based on past theorizing. In paper B, women might find they're actually being rewarded better than men who are equally similarly qualified. And in paper C, there's no statistically significant effect of gender on any of these, on any outcomes they tested, right? So three different papers, similar settings, maybe upper echelons. If you look at it, it's a very mixed terrain of findings. So the standard explanation for this could be it's the context. Something's different about what's being evaluated, something's different about the context in which it's being evaluated. I totally agree. In fact, some of my prior work has focused on unpacking the context of diversity and understanding when diversity yields the many benefits it's intended to yield. But I felt that just saying context matters is sort of a cop out. So we need more a theoretically driven understanding of how and why context matters, right? So this is what our paper does, is provides the theoretically grounded understanding of how context matters. For example, if you look at in the entrepreneurial setting, there's a growing body of research on founders of new ventures. Some are men, some are women. And you see that in the crowdfunding context, actually, women have a premium over men, or at least they get some premium from other women who are crowdfunders, because they're triggered by this affinity to the founding female. But in other settings, for example, in venture funding contexts, actually investors are sometimes driven by the fear that I'm not biased, but someone else is biased, right? So this notion of third party bias, what researchers call third party bias, kicks in. So in the same context of entrepreneurship, very different ways in which different evaluators are bringing their motives in. So just saying that context matters also, we felt, doesn't give enough fidelity to our ability to understand the mixed terrain of findings that you noted.
Professor, the paper challenges the long-standing assumption that giving more individualized information about women leaders will automatically reduce bias.
Yeah.
Why might more information not be enough, and sometimes even be used to justify biased decisions?
Yeah, this has been both in the theorizing on social biases as well as in the ways in which some of the theories have been applied. The idea is that if you have a new incoming leader of an underrepresented group, such as women, they tend to be more stereotyped because people just don't know enough about them. So if we give more information, if we tell more stories about this person, if they hear more about this person, they will that stereotyping will, that what we call social categorizing, will end into in groups and out groups, and the person will be recategorized as an in group member. So that's kind of as one of us, right? So where we thought of them as the other, we'll think of them as one of us. So that's kind of the thinking about how information can play a role in reducing biases. But even when I'm telling you this, you are already probably thinking that in the real world, that's not how it works, right? People, when you give them data and actually literally give them data, give them empirical findings, you're going to have questions about, but I see the data in this way, you see it in that way. So even from a outside of gender, we know that when we look at data, when we look at information, many of us might bring our own lenses to it. Now, imagine that in the case of underrepresented leaders such as women leaders, right? That whole idea gets even more blown up, if you will. So the same thing, it's not neutral, it's raw material. So if you're the notion, what the theory we use here is motivated cognition. And the notion is that we use this to build conclusions that we want to arrive at. So we have certain conclusions in our mind. We are going to reach those conclusions given the same data. So if you tell one of the observers who wants to protect that identity threat idea, right? They want to protect their sense of self, and you give them all this information, going back to that restructuring or the cost reduction idea, you give them all this information, they might still not update their belief, right? They might say, and if that venture turns out successful, if the scenario that I walked you through earlier, if that turns out to be successful, then they might just say, yeah, she got lucky, the market was right, right? We as a team carried her, that's why she's able to call it a success, right? Now the same data point, if you give to someone else, they might say, wow, this leader clearly has skills to turn a struggling division around, right? So the same information can be viewed very differently. So I think as researchers, we need to dispel that, keep aside that assumption that all we need is more information, because that has often driven not just our research, but the interventions that follow from it.
Professor, let's zoom in on identity protection motives. How do identity threat and identity affinity among observers lead to very different outcomes for women leaders, ranging from exclusion and reputational harm to active sponsorship and resource provision?
Yeah, so this is where we get into the weeds with each of the motives. Each motive has different dimensionality to it. So for the identity threat motive, I gave the other example of usually because many of these C-suites and upper echelons are highly male dominated. If a male observer comes across a woman leader, that could be a threat based on she's not like us, she's not one of us, sort of a feeling. And so she doesn't really fit in. So that's not my in group, that's my out group, right? So that's a threat mechanism for the same identity of gender in this case. Now, and so in that setup, that sort of threat reactions about discrediting the female leader, viewing assertiveness as being aggressive, seeing confidence as being cold, and excluding people from their own inner circle comes into play. But from a gender perspective, if I, as the observer, maybe I'm a fellow CEO, maybe I'm a female a woman on the board of directors. I've gone through the same challenges that the focal leader is going through. I see an affinity with that person, right? I see what she's going through. I need to make sure that she doesn't struggle the same way I have, and I'll do whatever I can to support her, take her, build networks with her, or include her into my networks, and so on. So these are two elements of the same identity motive that it can manifest as a threat or it can manifest as affinity. So that's kind of so for each of these motives, we try to highlight they have additional dimensionality. So it gets it's more complex, but I think we also need to understand that.
Professor shows that value-based motives, political ideology, beliefs about meritocracy, or gender role attitudes shape leader evolution in powerful ways. How do these value alignment motives play out inside organizations that explicitly claim to value diversity and merit?
Yeah, so diversity and merit, many organizations might put that message around. So one of the things we look at is, so what predicts these different types of motives getting triggered? Are there me as an individual, my experiences, my background, does that predict it? Or is it certain aspects of the context? So one of the organizational features that can trigger the values motive is the organizations, how they espouse a value, right? So like you said, diversity and merit. So if you look at just if diversity has, so I think if you are putting forward an organizational value, it is the framing really matters, right? So if you're vague about it and say, you care about diversity and merit, merit can be a slippery slope. So many sociologists, such as Emilio Castilla's work on the meritocracy paradox, for example, speaks to this, right? So it's like, um, if you're using that meritocracy language, then it's a very vague idea, because everybody has their own notion of what is merit and who is meritorious, right? And that meritorious and merit idea can very easily be informed by who is the right person for the job, who is the ideal worker, who is the ideal leader. So I think one of the challenges is that, so using words like merit is a little bit more, can lead to that same idea that we then start infusing our own views into it. But on the other hand, if you're more explicit about valuing diversity, valuing people of different backgrounds, including them, and relating that to innovation, creativity, and so on, that can actually be, that can give people a clear signal or message of what the company's goals are, right? So I would just say that the word merit itself can be a bit of a slippery slope. And so uh, it does matter how organizations frame their values, because uh, we, even though we may not realize it, we are processing that and applying that to our decision making.
Professor, the model introduces the idea of bilateral versus multilateral resource dependence. How do evolutions of women leaders differ when observers are directly dependent on leaders' success versus when they are also worried about how third parties might react?
Yeah, so this is a novel aspect, a truly novel and emerging aspect in the research, but it's also, I think, uh, if I might say, pretty cool from a purely research standpoint. Because, when in prior studies, when people think of leaders, they think of leaders, followers, right? You're a leader, I'm your direct report, so I'm the follower. So we are in this dyadic uh, relationship, and so that's what is the simple version of it. That's a simple case. It's bilateral, right? Your actions as a leader affect me as a direct report. So I'm going to watch what you're doing. I'm going to think about what you're doing. And I'm going to be evaluating you as a leader, because my fate is tied to what the focal leader does, right? That's bilateral. That's the simple bilateral relationship. Research shows that this kind of bilateral dependence actually makes the observer more aware of, or more conscious of accuracy. Like, they want to be accurate about the leader. They want, like the scenario that I gave you earlier. They are motivated towards accuracy, making sound, fair evaluations of the leader, because my fate hangs in balance, right? So I'm going to do that. The multilateral dependence is actually something that's come to the fore by the growing work, as I said, in the entrepreneurship setting. Now, if you're an investor investing in a new venture, you are certainly, it's a very different relationship. The leader, the quote unquote leader, is dependent on you as an investor. Not only that, you as an investor have many third party relationships that are important for the venture itself to be successful. You want to bring in more investors, you have, others that you want to run the portfolio by, and so on. So that's a multilateral dependent scenario. So here you're thinking of not just your relationship vis-a-vis the focal leader, you're also thinking of many other parties' involvement. And this is something that honestly prior research, leadership research specifically, even more broadly speaking, has not really considered in the social evaluations of leaders especially. So and here the whole narrative shifts a little bit, because now I'm thinking, hmm, this focal leader, she seems a little assertive. I like that. I think it's really important to be assertive as a new venture founder. But do you think, Bob or Ramesh is going to like that? They might find it more problematic, right? So maybe we should be a little careful about this, right? So now that investor is this. I mean, to me, it's a cop out because I think the investor is making assumptions about Bob and Ramesh, but that unfortunately is often an assumption that people make, right? I'm not biased. Others may be biased, so maybe this is not a good timing for making this investment, right? So I think that's often a way we also think, that people think, and that sort of multilateral, what we call multilateral dependence, it's kind of a bias by proxy, generates this bias by proxy idea, which I think is pretty fascinating from a purely academic standpoint, and also from the standpoint of thinking of what interventions we need.
Professor, your review has important implications for interventions. Instead of asking women to adapt, lean in, change their style, or constantly navigate the double bind, you argue for targeting observer motives and evaluation systems. What might a truly motive-aware interventions look like in practice?
Yeah, I think this is, I hope it generates a more conversation around this, because it's not going to be a simple fix, right? In some ways, it may be easier to say, hey, let's send our upcoming rising leader to this new leadership development program. That's an easier fix, right? I think, but I think if you model, or if you customize the solutions with some awareness of what motives are driving people, right? If it's an identity threat motive, research shows, for example, that affirming observers, reminding them of their worth, their value, what they bring to the table, can reduce that threat feeling. It's called affirmation, and it's a way that to reduce threat from observers. With the value alignment, also, not everybody wants to hear the diversity and inclusion language, right? So it may be a little bit of framing, a little bit of curation of how you're disseminating uh, the ideas behind the interventions. It's about innovation, it's about creativity, it's about bringing the best out of people. And that's what diversity programs should do. But often, I think framing it from a more innovation, which we can all agree that we all want to learn from each other. We can all agree that we all want greater innovation for our companies, right? So I think maybe framing, how you frame and curate the information about various interventions takes into account, some of these motives as well. And I think, with this idea that I talked about in the previous, the multilateral dependence and this notion of, bias by proxy, if you will, I think that idea can also be neutralized by being more transparent. Like, we have no information, let's actually bring all that information out. Don't make assumptions that others are biased, right? In fact, you could try thinking of a counterfactual where, Bob and Ramesh might find that idea really compelling, because they come from and in fact, their childhood upbringing, their backgrounds actually want to see more women leaders in roles, right? So I think, to some extent, it's not everything I'm saying is not new per se, and I'm not trying to reinvent the wheel here. But I do think that just taking what we have, but thinking more in terms of what's the audience for this, which we do for so many of our other organizational practices and programs. We, market test it. We try it on different consumer segments, right? We often get that kind of information in benchmarking other kinds of strategies. So same with diversity related strategies is better and know the audience, I think, is the big picture sort of overview from our paper.
Professor, you also raised future research questions around intersectionality and the extension of this framework to men who violate traditional gender norms. How might your motive driven model help us understand biases towards leaders at the intersection of gender, race, and age?
Yeah, I think this is obviously some aspects of this are more complicated. In this paper, at least, we're talking more about women leaders. But gender is not just about women, it's about men and women. And there is a whole area of research on men, masculinities, how men are viewed, when are men penalized for either adhering to gender roles, like the breadwinner concept, versus going against that role and becoming more caregivers, right? So men also face similar tensions in their lives about being breadwinners versus caregivers. And our idea in talking about gender, and any gender scholar will say that matters a lot as well. In fact, I would hope, and that also in that literature also there are tensions. I mean, there's some researchers who have found that there's a debate there, right? So some researchers have found that if men are more uh, nurturing or they step outside of masculine norms, they also get penalized. They receive similar backlash from other men, mostly from other men, right? And some say that men actually get away with it, that they actually face, like, there is this, just as there's a motherhood penalty, there's a fatherhood premium. So men actually, if you see a man holding a baby, everybody's like, oh, how nice, how wonderful, right? A woman holding a baby is rarely going to get that. So my point is simply that there is a debate about, do men get penalized or do they all receive some kind of rewards for stepping outside the norms. So I think so. There is again, I think because of that similar sort of mixed debate and a mixed terrain, I think our framework might apply. Let's look at the motives. What do you want to see from this? And I do think changing gender role expectations for men is equally important, if not, I would say a little more important, because they can really shift the conversation. So in the paper, we talk more about this, about how our framework can be applied perhaps to men. The intersectionality issue is much more complex. There is a body of research on it, more US focused, because topics like race have been very, very significant in the US, North American context, more so than I would say in the Indian context, perhaps. So the examples from there are a little harder to generalize to the Indian context. But, there is research which shows that, for example, younger kids, African American kids who are girls uh, associated, are seen as older because that allows people to be harsher towards them. For East Asian women, there is an opposite thing. East Asian women are treated as if they're younger, so they're infantilized. So there is a sort of a connection between age and people's race, which is where some intersectionality research has focused. And I think that, again, penalties as well as premiums, depending on how these different age and race-based stereotypes and gender-based stereotypes connect. And I think, again, I would say, yeah, absolutely. I think the motives can also dictate how you are. So this is more complex. It's how you are in your mind bringing these different stereotypes together. So that's probably for a different paper and a very different paper. But I do think our some of our conclusions would apply.
Professor Aparna, I would like to conclude this episode with one last question. Finally, for leaders, boards, and HR practitioners listening to this conversation, what are two or three practical design choices around selection, performance evaluation, or board processes that can help redirect observer motives toward more equitable evolutions of leadership?
Yeah, well, this is the program for all of us for the future. I think, again, this is such a complex space. There's no quick fixes, no silver bullets, if you will. So I want to, start by saying that. Okay. But if I had to say, like, if there were three things I would say, and not, as I said, not everything is new, but bringing this lens into it perhaps helps to further reshape and innovate the interventions that already exist. So I think, you know, who is in the room matters. So, if assuming that we all bring in different motives, some is affinity, for some, maybe affinity, for some, it may be threat. Some of our values might drive us towards more egalitarian attitudes and so on. So I do think that having, if it's to the highest levels, having a selection committee that is diverse at least sets the stage for reducing the negatives, because you will have probably balance out that with positives or more positives. So the in selection committees and hiring and recruiting committees, I do think the importance of diversity and representation is super important. I want to kind of reinforce that. uh, I think some of our message is also around accountability and transparency, right? So if we are made accountable for our motives. So tell me again why you think this person is not qualified, because she has like 10 years of profit and loss, P&L experience, and you're saying she doesn't have the experience. So calling people out, putting them in the spotlight can also, so you need people in that room who can have, in our work here at University of Michigan, we talk about something called integrity pauses. In those meetings, in those high stakes meetings, have one or two people who can bring in those integrity pauses to say, wait a second, why did you say that she might take time off for maternity? How do you know he might not need time for an older dependent or for his kids, right? So, this idea of just tell me again, can you explain more? Even a simple thing like that makes people have to verbalize what they're why they've made that claim or what motives are driving them, right? And that puts things out. It makes it transparent and accountable. It makes people accountable for the stances they're taking. And I think this is the third party bias by proxy idea. Our research shows that actually most women actually get a premium, are viewed very favorably by their followers. So in supervisor subordinate sort of contexts, those contexts, actually women are rated highly by people, the subordinates in the organization. So you might want to know exactly what this third party is and say that my information shows me that actually she has very favorable ratings in the rank and file. That many of our younger men and women look up to her in this role, right? Want to see her as a role model in that role. So you can flip that idea that everyone is biased to thinking that maybe people are looking for a change here, right? So maybe people want a change. So I think flipping that narrative, even from the standpoint of what we are making assumptions constantly that people are biased and so on, and let's put that aside and think of, let me pose a counterfactual to you and let's make this assumption instead, right? So I think that might be another intervention. So early speaking, I'd say pay attention to who's in the room in making high stakes decisions. Make sure they're armed with these integrity pauses to halt the conversation, and transparency around where does this third party bias come from, and maybe it really doesn't exist. So it's worth thinking about those three things.
Thank you, Professor Aparna Joshi, for sharing such rich insights on how observer motives shape gender biases in leader evolutions. Your work not only helps us understand why the same women leader can be seen so differently across contexts, but also points us toward interventions that target systems and evaluators rather than asking women to endlessly adapt. To our listeners, we hope this conversation invites you to reflect on our own evaluative lenses, whether as managers, colleagues, investors, or scholars, and to think about how identity, value, and resource concerns might be silently shaping your judgments. Professor Aparna Joshi, thank you for joining us on Business Talk. It's been an absolute privilege to have you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Deepak. It's been a pleasure talking with you and sharing our research. And thank you again for putting a spotlight on our work. Thank you so much.
Thank you.